This is a response to Sizai, hope I pronounced that right, who asked me what I believed when I was a theist and what I believe now. I could spend seconds answering those questions or hours. I'm going to compromise and try and cover a range of ideas over 3 videos. It won't be exhaustive, but hopefully it'll give a decent enough feel for the scope of where I'm coming from. So to the first question, what exactly did I believe prior to my conversion, including its limits or uncertainties, but not explicitly trying to discredit it? What I believed encompassed a lot. My beliefs evolved substantially over my time as a Christian. For brevity, I'm going to break it down into 3 broad phases. The Santa phase. In very early childhood, I believed everything I was told, uncritically, including biblical and modern miraculous interventions. I thought of the Christian God I was indoctrinated to believe in as a kind of benevolent avuncular ghost, a bit like an all-seeing, all-knowing Santa. I believed he could do absolutely anything without limit, and that he smiled when we were good and was sad when we were bad. My understanding of Bible stories was similarly sanitized. For example, in the version of Noah's Ark I was taught at school, God saw a flood coming and warned Noah so he could tell everyone. This sanitization was shattered when I watched John Huston's movie The Bible. Through that movie, and my subsequent questions and reading, I saw a very different depiction of this God. The psycho phase. I wouldn't have been able to put a word to it back then, but the qualities being proposed gave me a sense of what I would now call a psychopath. For instance, I was horrified to learn that in the story of Noah, God didn't just see the flood coming, he intended it as a deliberate act of genocide. There were several other deliberately cruel acts that I found deeply disturbing, including the story of Job, whose life was eviscerated when God allowed it to become the object of a bet with Satan. But the standout story for me back then was the testing of Abraham, instructed by God to kill his son Isaac as a sacrifice. I found that story profoundly unsettling as a child. It horrified me that God would put someone through that extended mental torture, facing the prospect of murdering their child. Then there was the obedience of Abraham, who was fully prepared to kill Isaac. Would my parents be prepared to kill me if God asked them to? And what if Abraham had refused to kill his son? After all, when Adam and Eve disobeyed him, having been deliberately deceived into doing so, he punished the entire human race. I still believed in God, but my previous image of him was shattered. In Robert Graves's I, Claudius, when Caligula returns victorious from an imagined war with the god Neptune, he flies into a murderous rage when he finds out there are no fanfares to greet him. The Roman senators are terrified and point out that Caligula specifically ordered no fanfares. Caligula berates them for taking him at his word, telling them he was leaving it up to them to show their love for him by disobeying him and preparing fanfares. The test was set up so that whatever they did, they could be punished. And the same with this God, who could instruct you to do something you knew was wrong, like murder, and put you in the no-win situation of choosing which transgression you were going to commit. The stories of Noah and Abraham were just 2 of many that changed my emotional position to one of anxiety. The security I'd felt before was gone, replaced with apprehension and vulnerability. The Binker phase. In this phase, which took me to the age of about 12, Jesu became the focus of my beliefs, eclipsing, and to a huge extent mitigating, God's dark unpredictability. I was switched on by the counterintuitive nature of his perspective, befriending prostitutes, berating the godly for their judgments and hypocrisies. I found this flipping of concepts radical and inspiring, and I began a substantial re-examination of my views on right and wrong. Where God was unfathomable, vengeful, and set traps, Jesu seemed consistent, forgiving, and transparent. Things essentially came full circle. What God used to be, his Son now became. A benevolent presence watching over us, who smiled when we were good and was sad when we were bad. His betrayal and torture also played on feelings of protectiveness, as well as guilt by association, because of what we humans had done to him. He felt emotionally available and dramatically charged. I managed the split between God and Jesu, rather like the monkeys in Harlow's Wire Mother experiments, maintaining essential engagement with the God concept, but firmly ensconced in the psychological comfort of Christ. I believed the purpose of Christianity was to follow Christ's example. My faith wasn't a license to judge, that was God's job. It wasn't about hypocritical displays of piety, or competing with others to be more righteous. It was about being a good neighbour, looking for the good in others, treating them with respect and understanding, striving for virtue, and making the world a better place. So, those were the three major phases of belief, which, as I say, are broken down like that for brevity. When I was prompted to question my beliefs by a religious education teacher, there was an explosion of variations in my ideas, all concertinaed into a very short space of time. I began to entertain metaphorical interpretations rather than literal. I even teetered on the brink of a crossover to evangelism. I made heartfelt prayers to whatever was out there to communicate itself to me directly. At that point, I felt like I was swimming in people's conflicting opinions about what God was, and I just wanted to push all of that aside and find out what God was from God himself. In my childhood, the line between imagined and real relationships was blurred. As children, we learned to have relationships with all kinds of inanimate objects. We learned doublethink, inventing the psychological lives of our toys, then really believing those inner lives exist independently of us. We become practiced in a range of thinking skills that allow us to project our own ideas out there, then receive them back as if they were from an external, independent origin. Previously, I'd used those skills to answer my own prayers, with meaningless signs to which I'd attributed meaning. When I stopped playing both parts in this way and started waiting for clear, unambiguous responses, I found absolutely nothing came through. I made fleeting passes at other religions. Even as my belief ebbed away, I continued to go through the motions, as if I believed, fully expecting that my belief would eventually return. It was wryly amusing years later to read that this was one of the pieces of advice Pascal recorded in his Pensées, addressing those who have a hard time believing. But my faith never did return, and my atheism commenced when I finally acknowledged a simple but profound truth. A dialogue with only one participant is a monologue. In this part, I'll move on to Saizai's questions about what I believe now. He asked, what exactly do you believe now of gods? Do you affirmatively believe that any god or gods do not exist? If yes, how certain are you? What gods does this belief apply to? And why do you hold this belief? Well, I affirmatively believe the Prince Philip volcano god doesn't exist. Villagers on the South Pacific island of Tanna believe that Prince Philip, who stopped by Vanuatu in the 1970s, fulfilled their legend of a divine volcano spirit who would take the form of a pale-skinned man and travel far in search of a powerful wife. However seriously they might believe this, we can show he's not that deity. Their deity originates from Tanna. Prince Philip originated from Corfu. With such easy falsification, it's clear why we don't tend to hear such down-to-earth god concepts these days. The ideas that have survived posit gods progressively further out of reach. From mountains, volcanoes and oceans, to space and beyond, to abstract metaphysical locations, with an expanding physical and philosophical distance that substantially obscures any possibility of evidence or falsifiability. I'll be looking at unknowable claims in the third video, but even with all these supposedly unreachable gods, we can still rule out many concepts, in much the same way we can with the Prince Philip god, by identifying fatal contradictions and discrepancies. A basic example of the kind of clash I'm talking about is the one between the concept of omnibenevolence and the concept of hell. Infinite compassion does not condone or abide infinite torture. There's a similar clash with beings who are proposed as both intrinsically immortal and intrinsically omnipotent. The concept of omnipotence by itself has had philosophers debating for centuries over various proposed paradoxes, such as the task of creating a rock that can't be lifted, or creating a square circle, with arguments about whether the paradox lies not in the omnipotence, but in the task itself, which Maimonides refers to as pseudo-tasks. But I'm looking at a task that contains no logical impossibility: killing yourself. It's something we humans are capable of. So we have the conflict. If gods can kill themselves, they can't then be intrinsically immortal. On the other hand, if they can't kill themselves, they're not omnipotent. This combination of characteristics is fatal. The being can't be both. It's been put to me that if the omniscient being is intrinsically immortal, then to ask it to kill itself is again asking a logically impossible feat. Even an omnipotent being can't do things which conflict with its own nature. Omnipotence now moves from being the ability to do anything to the ability to do anything that doesn't conflict with the being's other properties. Problem is, by that definition, I'm omnipotent. I have the ability to do anything that doesn't conflict with my other properties. For instance, by myself, I can't fly or breathe water. Not because I'm not omnipotent, but because for me, those things are logically impossible based on my physical and psychological properties. To ask me to do them is unfair. The word almighty seems to be making something of a comeback. But this nebulous term doesn't provide the sanctuary it might appear to offer. The biblical account of the Tower of Babel, or Babel if you prefer, offers an interesting little commentary on human omnipotence. It was written that, at the time, humans only spoke one language, and they decided to build a city with a tower that reached to heaven. Genesis 11, verses 5 and 6, describes the biblical God coming down and saying, if, as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. He then thwarts that possibility by confusing their language so they couldn't understand each other. Nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. It doesn't get much plainer than that. That's omnipotence. Divine free will and omniscience present another contradiction. Some suggest an omniscient being could deliberately restrict its knowledge to facilitate its own free will. But to restrict knowledge immediately destroys omniscience. Some suggest that it could simply know the consequences of every possible course of action it might take, making it free to choose. This line of argument is an immediate non-starter for those who propose timeless gods, who perceive the past, present and future simultaneously. Those who propose gods that operate within time sometimes suggest these deities know only the past and present. The future's a mystery, even to them. But this contradicts the supporting texts of their religion. For instance, in Psalm 139, verse 4, we have the line, "Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely." Then later, in verse 16, "Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book, before one of them came to be." In Isaiah 46, verse 10, Yahweh is depicted declaring the end from the beginning. A passage echoed later on in chapter 48, verse 3, "I foretold the former things long ago. My mouth announced them, and I made them known. Then suddenly I acted, and they came to pass." This describes a being who knows not just what could happen, but what will happen, and furthermore, the active part it will play in that plan. It's difficult to argue how a being who knows not just every physical fact, but all of our private intentions, could fail to predict the future. Even if we were generous enough to grant mind-matter duality, with both of these covered in divine claims, what other variables are left to inject uncertainty? And the problems with omniscience don't end there. Alfred Hitchcock found the process of shooting his films a tedious mechanical exercise. He felt he'd done all his creative work already with the writing and storyboarding, visualizing the movie right down to its final cuts. Likewise, an omniscient creator's done all of its creative work already, before it sets its creation in motion. From the moment of creation, everything is quintessentially mechanical. Taking the 3 Bible stories mentioned in part 1, omniscience means the God of the Bible would have known that Adam and Eve would have been confused by the serpent into disobeying him. There could be no anger in response to this event. Anger reflects a sentiment that something's happened that shouldn't have happened. But an omniscient being, who knows before it sets its creation in motion how everything will turn out, can feel no more anger than we can feel anger when we consciously allow a brick to fall from our hand and descend under a force of gravity to smash a plate. Same with the flood. God's apparent disappointment at his creation is impossible. Disappointment is the non-fulfillment of what one hopes. An omniscient being doesn't hope, it knows. We're told the angel of the Lord stops Abraham from killing his son, saying, "Now I know that thou art a God-fearing man." Now I know? An omniscient God would have known all the time. For omniscience to be true, stories involving divine surprise, emotional reaction, or reassessment must be false. For those stories to be true, omniscience must be false. Whatever the case, the combination is fatally incompatible. It's an aporia, a path that leads nowhere. It'll be clear that a lot of contradictions spring up around the prefix omni. Claims of beings who can do everything, know everything, be everywhere, possess infinite compassion, etc., might have seemed impressive when they were proposed, but when we attempt to integrate them, especially in view of a reality chock full of immorality and suffering, these ill-conceived concepts collapse under the weight of their own over-ambition. Perhaps the pinnacle of over-ambition is the idea of perfection. There's a lot of disagreement about what attributes a perfect being would possess. Some argue that it would be perfectly empathic, others argue it would be perfectly detached, etc. Whatever the case, perfection sets up considerable problems. Matthew 7, verse 18 puts the point succinctly. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. A perfect God creates a perfect human, and imperfection comes of it? How can a perfect being sin? We can't just say, because it just decides to. Why would it decide to? What possible need would it be serving? The answer? An imperfect need. And where did the imperfect need come from? When we work back to find the point of transition from perfection to imperfection, the problem is unworkable. Free will or no free will, perfect beings, human or divine, don't make imperfect choices. Those who argue they do are arguing that a good tree can bear bad fruit. The problem extends to imperfect revelation. Some argue that it isn't their God's revelation that's imperfect, but human error in conveying that revelation. In arguing this, they unwittingly highlight the nature of their deity's imperfection, the woefully error-prone method by which it's chosen to reveal itself. Some suggest there's grand design behind this imperfect revelation. An argument proposed by one Michael Murray for the Judeo-Christian God is that it has to remain hidden to preserve our moral freedom. He argues that if we were powerfully aware of the truth of God's existence, we'd be coerced into moral behavior. Choosing good would be irresistible. Several flaws here. For starters, various figures purported to have had direct experience of their God had no trouble disobeying him. A prime example is Cain, who spoke directly to Yahweh and yet went on to kill his brother. And let's not forget the supposed epitome of evil, Satan. You've also got to ask, what happens to moral freedom when you get to heaven? Another argument defending imperfect revelation suggests that revelations are deliberately obscure, because gods want people to search them out. But with the proliferation of available God concepts, the scope of what's being asked here is impossibly vast. You're out in the middle of nowhere. You're told the truth is out there, you just have to search for it. There's a bewildering number of signposts around you, each claiming to be the right way. You pick a direction, or more likely have it pick for you, and start walking. You walk for miles, but there are no gods. Occasionally, you meet people along the way who say you chose the right direction, although they can never say how far you have to go. After many miles, the truth finally dawns on you. There are people in every single direction who will tell you exactly the same thing. Their path is the right one, and you just have to keep walking. It now becomes clear the task is impossible. You have a limited number of years in your life. You could spend them all walking in the same futile direction. You could spend them all trying multiple futile directions, and obviously the length of time you spend on each journey is divided by the number of directions you try. It's impossible to investigate every idea in any depth, so requiring any depth of investigation sets an impossible condition. What's being proposed is a game of pure chance. You could say my atheism is a refusal to play an impossible game. The unknown purpose defense is often presented as a catch-all fallback argument. It asserts that there is a purpose, but it's unknown. 2 points here. One, the unknowable purpose defense cuts both ways. Yes, an unknown purpose can't be criticized. It can't be assessed in any way. But that also destroys any claim that the purpose must necessarily be benevolent or morally good. To establish that requires that the purpose is understood. Those who evoke the unknown purpose defense give up any grounds to refute suggestions that the purpose could be perverse, callous, or sadistic. 2. Whatever the unknown purpose is supposed to be, as I've shown, we can still rule out unworkable purposes. And that's enough in itself to refute whole classes of divine claims. Rather than defend their gods, some prefer to blame the non-believer. Some suggest God never answered when I was a Christian because I was testing him, or because I didn't have enough faith. Both wrong. I didn't need proof. I already believed. I wanted a relationship, and it was a mark of my utter faith that I fully believed I could have one. Critics have also asserted that God was talking to me. I just wasn't hearing him. Let's get this straight. There's me, totally receptive and faithful. There's the Christian God I believed in, equally keen for a relationship with me, aware of exactly what it would take to communicate that to me. But he decides instead to talk to me in a way he knows full well I can't hear. What bizarre pointlessness. Reminds me of those scenes you sometimes get in comics where characters explain things to themselves they already know for the benefit of some invisible observer. These are just a few of many contradictory concepts that can be ruled out. This is about contradictory concepts. Concepts of perverse or sadistic gods aren't contradictory in themselves. There's only a contradiction if other irreconcilable attributes are proposed. When we rule out contradictory concepts, we're left with concepts of gods who are unwilling and/or unable to reveal themselves to every human. And that means any system proposing punishment for non-belief is irretrievably unjust. I'll end by returning to the issue of how certain I am that these gods don't exist. The objections I've given in this video are based on rational contradictions, but there are those who see even logic and reason as based on contingent divine rules. This harks back to the subject of omnipotence. Some, like William of Ockham, saw omnipotence expressed in two forms, potentia absoluta and potentia ordinata. With absolute power, the deity is free to choose to actualize any possibilities. But once they're decided on, the deity's ordained power kicks in, i.e. it plays by its own rules and restricts itself from exercising absolute power. As a side note, isn't it remarkable how specific we're getting about exactly how these gods operate? It's important to bear in mind the question of how this detailed information about incorporeal beings was arrived at. Anyway, some argue that we only experience logic, reasoning, justice, morality, in the form we do, because the gods just set it up like that. Some argue that the gods don't even have to obey the law of contradiction, allowing them, for instance, to undo past events so that they never happened. As mentioned before, arguments that allude to the unknown cut both ways. Those arguing against the use of reason and logic, on the premise that they're divinely arbitrary, should notice the ground crumbling beneath their own feet. Firstly, this argument creates a paradox in that it's reasoning against the validity of reasoning. The premise destroys itself. Secondly, when discussing the existence of incorporeal beings, for which by definition there can be no physical evidence, to discount the tools of reason and logic leaves no resources for asserting the existence of gods. So, how certain am I that these kinds of contradictory concepts don't exist? I'd say, I'm certain beyond reasonable doubt. In the final part of this video triptych, I'll be looking at claims I believe to be unknowable. This is the last of a three-part response to Sizai, who asked about my former religious beliefs and the views I now hold. This video serves as a catch-all, essentially covering all claims not covered in the previous video, which dealt with concepts I affirmatively believe don't exist. So, to the last two questions. What claims do you believe to be unknowable, and why? In replying to this, I want to look at various kinds of evidence and arguments proposed in support of divine claims, along with their inherent problems. I'll also elucidate where I'm coming from with the title of this series. First of all, for me, talk of absolute unknowability is a red herring. Just like talk of absolute knowledge, I'd suggest that speculating on what we can never know, when we don't know everything we don't know, isn't the most productive use of our time. I think it's more worthwhile to look at what's unknowable to us right now, and the obstacles blocking its knowability. Two big obstacles for divine claims are definition and methodology. Let's consider two scenarios, where the task is to know what the other side of the moon looks like. In the first, the moon's defined as a flat disk that floats like a cloud in the air. We've guessed it's about 500 meters up, although oddly it seems to move further away as we approach it. We conclude that it senses humans and tries to evade us. In the second scenario, the moon's defined as we know it today. We can see how these different definitions will lead to different methodologies. With the first definition, we can't get near the moon ourselves, so what's open to us? Well, we notice it doesn't move when we throw rocks or fire arrows at it. We set about designing powerful projectiles to flip the moon. This will of course fail. In the second scenario, we use precision measurements to design an efficient space rocket to take us safely up there ourselves. This succeeds. Both of these experiences are valuable. Our success brought us knowledge, but so did our failure. We learned that our initial assumptions were wrong. As we eliminate our errors and correct our course, our definitions become increasingly sharper, and so does our methodology. Now let's imagine a third scenario. Let's say we define the moon as a mental projection, an intangible representation of a life form that dwells on another plane of existence. We rule out physical answers in favour of mental ones. We ask the lunar life form to reveal its far side to our imaginations. People draw what they think the moon's communicated to them. The drawings look nothing like each other. At this point, it would seem sensible to reject this definition, and we can all understand why, can't we? How do we possibly eliminate errors? But the people don't reject this definition. The idea they were in personal communion with this life form made them feel special. They assert that their design's correct, that other folks are deluded. They just don't have that special connection with the moon. They gravitate towards people with similar designs, who seem to validate their own. They teach their children that their design's correct. When the children try to commune with the moon, they must see this image too. If not, they're not in touch with the moon. Each generation passes it to the next. Some folks start covering up or destroying other people's designs, saying they're an insult to the moon. Conflict arises between groups. The weaker groups and the less attractive designs lose ground. And while some of them manage to sustain a small core of followers, a handful of popular designs come to dominate. The cause of all this unnecessary conflict? A flawed definition. A misguided thought in someone's head about how to explain something in the universe, and a human propensity to hold on to flawed ideas that make us feel special, rather than face those flaws and seek out a better idea. There's an important difference between the lunar lifeform idea and the idea of gods. We can see the moon. It's a phenomenon that exists and requires an explanation. With gods, there's no evidence anything's there at all. But quite incredibly, that doesn't seem to matter. We still see the same claims of personal knowledge, the same indoctrination of children, and most regretfully of all, the same hostilities. Compared to the first two scenarios, it's clear something strange is going on here. The God idea generates multiple conflicting truths. They can't all be right. Without a reliable method of eliminating errors, this situation is hopeless. Some argue they do have justification for their specific deities. So let's look at them. At the most basic level, we have the bald assertion, I just know my gods exist. No reason given other than a sense of personal connection. The argument fails because if it works for you, it works for everyone. If person A's claim of personal knowledge validates her gods, then the personal knowledge claims of people from every religion validate their gods. Claims that apply across the board favour no individual claim and can be cancelled out. So, personal conviction is clearly not a workable criterion. I once saw the ghost of a dead baby in my laundry basket. It was the saddest thing I ever saw. Mind you, when I looked again, I realised it was a dirty hanky. We know how prone to error the human brain is. We know humans experience all kinds of unreal events based on delusional perceptions, deception, hallucinations, or psychotic breaks prompted by various causes, including stress, bereavement, or drugs, or plain old false pattern recognition. We also know humans experience a huge range of physical sensations. We go cold with fear, numb with terror, sick with panic. We get rushes of excitement. As a very young child, I used to feel like the air was physically fizzing sometimes. These and other sensations have well-documented physiological causes. Until natural explanations can be ruled out, we have no reason to even start looking elsewhere. And again, if it works for you, it works for everyone. Ignorance is a key component of miracle claims, whether that's ancient claims like resurrections or more modern ones like journalist Malcolm Muggeridge's claim of divine light, when footage taken by his cameraman Ken Macmillan at Mother Teresa's dingy home for the dying in Calcutta came out brighter than expected. Unbeknownst to Muggeridge, Macmillan had simply used a new light-sensitive Kodak film. With each miracle claim, I can't explain it, magically becomes, it can't be explained, which magically becomes, it has been explained, the gods did it. The claim rests on the absurd, paradoxical assertion, I don't know, therefore I do know. Ignorance is not an argument for knowledge. In 1800, in his book The Life of Washington, Parson Weems conveyed the story of a young George Washington admitting he'd administered some fatal hackings to his father's cherry tree. But there's no evidence that this ever happened, like many supposed snatches of history. The cherry tree incident is considered apocryphal, an invention, in this case designed to inspire children to virtue. People suggest that because I'm an atheist, I reject all religious historical claims out of hand, but accept all non-religious ones as knowledge. They're doubly wrong. But arguments over whether or not the Hittites existed, or the Egyptians drank wine, have no bearing on the authenticity of a talking donkey. No one disputes the historical details of Malcolm Muggeridge's visit to see Mother Teresa. But those historical details do nothing to support his miracle claim. Magic can't be smuggled in under the protection of historical evidence. Prayers, near-death experiences, the list goes on. If conflicting God concepts claim the same justification, then it's not eliminating errors. Aside from the evidential arguments for the existence of gods, various arguments have been proposed based on logic, but I've yet to hear a single one that doesn't contain at least one fatal flaw. We have the multi-flawed kalam, which falls down on its first premise. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The phrase begins to exist refers to creation ex nihilo, creation from nothing. This contrasts with creation ex materia, creation from pre-existing matter. The problem with proposing creation from nothing is that for a cause to be a cause, it has to act on something. To have an effect, there has to be something there to be affected. A cause acting on nothing to produce something is a magical explanation. When we ask how this God's supposed to have created the universe, one word crops up repeatedly. It's said to have willed creation to happen, and this bizarre assertion is presented as if it's explained something. It hasn't. It makes no less sense to talk about swimming the universe into existence, or laughing it into existence. Willing has no more been established as a mechanism for the creation of matter than any of these other verbs. Among the shortcomings of the transcendental argument for God is that it sets up a false dichotomy between physical and conceptual. It argues that because logical absolutes, such as the law of identity, don't have physical existence, i.e. the laws themselves aren't composed of physical material, then they must be conceptual. And if they're conceptual, they require a mind. And that mind is a God. It might require a mind to formulate the equation A equals A, but tag proponents haven't demonstrated that a mind is required for an object to be the same as itself. The transcendental argument commits a fallacy of equivocation, equating human logical statements with the reality they describe. The slippery old ontological argument comes in various forms. It attempts to define a God into existence by defining existence as an intrinsic quality of a God. The arguments are founded on the idea that a God would be the greatest possible or perfect being, and that greatness or perfection would entail existence, since without existence, the being would not be as great or perfect. One of the many flaws of the ontological argument concerns the separability of existence. Existence isn't an add-on trait. Without existence, an object doesn't somehow keep all of its other qualities. When we posit a God that exists and a God that doesn't exist, we don't have two gods, both omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, etc. Oh, but one has the added feature of existence. A God that doesn't exist is nothing. Existence is an intrinsic quality of anything that exists. A man, a planet, a painting. If they have existence, they are themselves. If not, zilch. As with evidential arguments, these and other arguments suffer the same problem of being applicable to all kinds of God concepts. So even if these flawed arguments had worked, there's no path from them to specific deities. Not only do divine claims generate multiple ticks, they also seek to cover up their crosses. With remarkable consistency, whenever divine, or for that matter any magical claims, become specific enough to come within the bounds of knowable, they fall straight into knowably false. As the last video showed, overblown attributes like omnipotence and omniscience, which allow no restrictions or exceptions in their scope, soon come into conflict with other attributes that depend on those restrictions and exceptions. So, how are these clashes defended? A common strategy is to distort definitions. Let's take omnibenevolence versus hell. Omnibenevolence raises the concept of mere benevolence, a quality achievable by humans, to absolute proportions. It entails benevolence to all things, in all places, at all times. But what does that benevolence consist of? Some say it's not about mercy, forgiveness, or compassion, but about justice. Hence, they assert that delivering punishment is not inconsistent with this quality. But this contorted definition still doesn't work. The most abominable human that ever lived only committed finite crimes. Never mind turn the other cheek. To punish someone for eternity tips the scales way beyond even eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth mentality. There's no conceivable justice in eternal torture. Clearly, toughening up the softer side of this combination isn't going to cancel out the contradiction. So, how about tackling the fire that never shall be quenched? Discuss hell in any open forum, and eventually you'll be told the whole eternal torture thing's all wrong. You might be told that forever just means a long time. Some folks put out the fire altogether, scaling hell down to a realm of anarchy, or to a kind of group therapy, where people contemplate their shortcomings for a while before being forgiven and whisked away to some paradise. As these definitions lose all semblance of their original meaning, sure, the contradiction disappears. But as contradiction walks out the door, unknowability climbs in through the window. No matter how much you sanitize hell, its existence is impossible for us to establish. How do you acquire evidence for a destination that requires death as a passport? Without a means of substantiation, hell is unknowable. The same holds for other incoherent pairings. Yes, as we distort and dilute their definitions, the conceptual contradictions give way. But they only give way to the underlying problem of unknowability. We can all imagine fantasy beings, give them whatever attributes we like, specific powers and knowledge, methods of delivering the kinds of justice we want to make an unfair universe seem fair. And without demonstrable grounding in reality, nothing more substantial has taken place than a spot of creative writing. Other refutable claims are snatched into the apparent safety of unknowability by various kinds of reframing. Old claims of an immovable Earth were revised to accommodate the initially heretical heliocentric model. Immovable was reinterpreted as immovable from its orbit. An entirely different claim, but as we'll see, one that still doesn't work. Evangelist Ray Comfort chooses another tack. He tells the skeptic, run outside and move the Earth. Perhaps you and your friends could jump on it, or find a rocky outcrop and push it together. Maybe after that little experiment you'll concede that the Earth is immovable. This argument is as fatuous as suggesting an apple is unliftable because a fly can't lift it. Both defences fail. Anything's movable from its orbit by objects of adequate mass and momentum, or gravity. Or can the Earth resist black holes now? So where does this immovable Earth go from here? It gets reframed as phenomenological, representing subjective human experience, and joins other inaccurate descriptions of the universe, such as the sun hurrying back to where it rises. But this defense becomes problematic when the events described took place before humans were even around to misperceive them. But then comes the ultimate fallback. The language is merely poetic. Similar poetic license is granted to the Quran's account of the sun setting in a muddy spring, which becomes as if setting in a muddy spring. With passages sliding around between literal, phenomenological and metaphorical, and no qualms about adding all manner of ad hoc qualifications, the scope of potential meaning becomes hopelessly plastic. The wider the range of interpretations allowed, the more claims are pushed into unknowability. In covering all possibilities, no solid, testable claim is made. Other types of shift from knowably false to unknowable come in response to passages like Mark 16. where Jesu declares the signs that should accompany those who believe. Apart from unverifiable abilities like driving out demons and easily faked acts like speaking in tongues, it's claimed that those who believe can drink deadly poison without harm. Other passages are quickly cited that prohibit such fatal libations because they put gods to the test. If a sign of belief can never be demonstrated, in what possible sense can it then be a sign? Some claim this passage is parabolic, but parables are stories designed to illustrate some moral. Where's the story? Where's the moral? Others claim this passage is a post hoc, possibly 2nd century edition, that shouldn't even be in the Bible. So why is it still there? Well, try taking it out. You'll find vehement objection from folks who look at other standards of validity than details of human authorship, like the Pentecostals who drink diluted strychnine in specific reference to these verses. Although drinking non-lethal doses hardly embraces the deadly spirit of the verse, nor does it distinguish believers from non-believers, which was the whole point of the exercise. So, evidence against gods is pushed back into unknowability, made unusable through a variety of linguistic reinterpretations, as well as appeals to scriptural prohibitions and disqualifications. My atheism is basically a null hypothesis, when any positive claims made that some process or agent is responsible for a phenomenon. The null hypothesis states that that's not the case. In Western court trials, the positive claim is that person A is guilty. Therefore, the corresponding null hypothesis is that person A is not guilty. The null hypothesis is the default position, the position before proof, and it's the burden of the party making the positive claim to provide adequate justification to reject that default position. If it was the other way round, the problems would soon become apparent. In court, we'd be presumed guilty. New medicines would be presumed to work without testing, and every proposed magical being would be presumed to exist by default. From leprechauns to mermaids to every single god ever proposed. So, to positive claims that there are gods, I give you the null hypothesis. There are no gods. If someone feels they can propose a workable divine theory, I'm all ears. My loyalty is not to naturalism or materialism, as some folks suggest. My loyalty is to systems that demonstrate their claims. I don't have a clue what a workable divine theory would look like, and it's not my job to provide it. That's the burden of the proponent, but I do know what it would have to do. Gods are examples of what I call decapitated concepts. They sit on top of our understanding of reality, detached, unintegrated. An effective theory would have to integrate that concept with the universe, offering testable predictions and substantiating all specifically proposed characteristics of proposed entities. When that's demonstrated in practice, I'll happily reject my null hypothesis. What claims do you believe to be knowable by personal revelation? What evidence would you yourself accept, and why? Please use whatever is the minimum possible thing that would convince you of some sort of God existence that's within the cultural realms of things attributable to such revelations. Within cultural realms, nothing. What we're talking about is outside cultural realms. Miraculous displays are certainly pointless. As Arthur C. Clarke noted, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Centuries ago, a big booming voice from a tree might put the fear of gods into folk. Nowadays, we'd probably be thinking, oh, concealed speakers. Let's be clear about the function of revelation. It's not to dazzle or astonish, and it's not to mystify. The function of revelation is to reveal, to enhance understanding. What's presented as the supernatural can either be integrated into our understanding, or it can't. If it can't, then it's unknowable. Earlier on, I spoke about the apparent safety of unknowability. It's safe in that it's protected from falsification. The trouble is, so long as gods remain unknowable, the atheist null hypothesis remains intact. The only way forward for the gods concept is if it can be integrated, brought into the known, in which case supernatural is a provisional term, not permanent. If universe-creating beings with intentionality exist, then they operate by specific, defined principles and mechanisms. So, let's hear what they are. That's the only kind of revelation I'm interested in. Something with substantial informational content. Well, Sizai, thank you for your questions. I appreciate your comments about the vagueness of the term atheist. It doesn't reveal a great deal about the individual's specific rationale, but hopefully, in response to your precise questions, I've given you an idea of my personal position. Feel free to respond if you wish, but for now, take care.